Hi, everyone. My name is Nick Marshall, and I'm the Manager of Exhibitions and Programs at George Eastman Museum. I want to thank you for joining us today for our virtual gallery tour with Technology Curator Todd Gustavson. Todd is going to do a deep dive into our Kodak camera display case from the History of Photography Gallery here at the museum. This is the first time we've done a live webinar, so if there are any technical difficulties, which I'm sure there will be, I apologize in advance, but we'll try to troubleshoot along the way as any of those might come up. So before we get started, I do want to let everyone know that only Eastman Museum team will have access to speaking, but we welcome everyone to ask questions along the way. At the bottom of your screen, there should be an option for Q&A. Go ahead and click on that and you can submit questions. I'll monitor the questions as they come in, and at the end of Todd's presentation, we'll try to get as many questions, as many of your questions as possible.
Get over here. Over here.
We will be recording the presentation and posting it to our YouTube page in the near future. So if you'd like to access it again, just check back and hopefully it will be up in not too long. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Todd now and hope everything runs smoothly. So Todd, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, well, welcome to the George Eastman Gallery Tour. As you see, I'm trying to get my gallery assistant, Titan, to cooperate. So he's been my home office manager for 7 years now, and he's also my PowerPoint guru. So he's over now taking care of his prized possession, his blue ball. So just to give you a little bit of background, the technology collection at the George Eastman Museum consists of about 17,500 objects. We currently have around 7,000 cameras, and of those 7,000 cameras, I would say we have about 2,000 Kodak cameras. We're kind of in an interesting situation. A lot of the cameras were actually collected by Eastman Kodak Company. Over the years, they have donated their vast collections to the museum. Basically, what they did is they set aside pretty much brand new in the box examples of their product, and they also bought competitor products. So the collection consists of, again, along with the Eastman Kodak Company products, items from somewhere in the vicinity of 100 companies around the world. So it's really kind of an unusual situation. The collection is stored in a climate-controlled warehouse or vault, if you would. We're seeing kind of a bird's eye view of what the vault currently looks like. It's actually 2 stories with a mezzanine that we put in 2009. So we're actually going to be talking about cameras in the gallery, and we have probably about 24 Kodak cameras that are kind of trying to tell the story of how the company evolved over the years. And I guess we'll start with just George Eastman himself. George Eastman started out as a bank clerk, if you would. He had a number of customers that were investing in land in Santo Domingo. He wanted to make some money, so he thought he would look into doing this also. And he found out that to do this, you actually would have to document the land that you're going to buy. This is back in the wet plate era in the late 1870s. And to do this, instead of hiring somebody, he decided he would learn photography. So he went out to a local Rochester camera dealer, Henry Markson, bought a wet plate outfit, cost him around $50. This is the receipt for that. And he set about doing it, and actually, originally he had no success making images at all. He took lessons from a local photographer named George Monroe. Here's kind of a cartoon of him dragging his items around. And this is one of the first images that he made. This is of the Genesee River, for those of you who don't know Rochester, New York. It was an ambrotype. So back to the cartoon image. Mr. Eastman became much more interested in photography than in buying land in Santo Domingo. He started reading journals from England, many of which talked about dry plate photography. Gelatin dry plates had actually been around since the 1870s. Professional photographers didn't like them because they were kind of slow, meaning they weren't as light sensitive. But he thought this actually had some promise. So he started a little bit more research and decided to actually go into the business of making them. He actually patented a machine that would coat them, and by machine, we're actually talking about something we'd call a hopper that you'd fill up with light-sensitive material, and it actually would coat that on glass. This is actually an image of one of his glass dry plate coating machines. So he went into business and sold the plates originally through the E&H and Anthony Company of New York City. Anthony was one of the largest, if not the largest, distributor of photographic equipment in the US. As far as we know, this is the lone surviving box of Eastman's plates with the Anthony label on it. Now, Eastman realized that dry plates was a kind of a hot thing at the time. Again, this is in the early 1880s, but he kind of figured that this was not going to be where it was going to end up. So he started investigating into coating flexible material originally on paper. So in 1884, he came out with Eastman's negative paper film. So this is in some ways along the lines of what Talbot had been doing. This was in a roll. Professional photographers would purchase it. You'd actually need to have a roll holder. So he actually patented one along with William Walker. Would look like this. This is actually an Eastman Walker roll holder on a pretty rare camera. This is on a Genesee View camera, which we've recently acquired. I can't get too far into that one right now because it's not in this case, but it just shows you how it would have fit on the back. So Eastman basically did the experiments in film in his mother's kitchen, if you would. He was not a woodworker. He was not a cabinet maker, so he needed to have somebody who could do this for him. So as it turned out, he kind of walked across the street and found Frank Brownell, who happened to be a cabinet maker and made some cameras. It was just across the street from where his office was. This is a stereo dry plate camera manufactured by Brownell. As far as we know, it's the only known surviving camera that has Brownell's nameplate on it. And you can tell by looking at it, this is a pretty high quality camera. Brownell was a very talented guy. So getting into the whole concept of these types of cameras, we run into a problem in that he was intending to build this film, his flexible film, for professional photographers. There was one problem. Professional photographers just didn't like it. They found it to be difficult to process. You actually had to, believe it or not, float the image off the paper support. It was a gelatin emulsion on paper. You had to lift it off, kind of like a decal, put it on a glass plate and make the print. Photographers from that time period found this to be kind of annoying. They were perfectly happy with their dry plates. So rather than give up, he came up with this idea that he would build a camera for the amateur photographer. This was a market that was just coming into be. Initially, he produced what they called Eastman's detective camera. They made enough parts to build maybe 35 of them. It was not a big seller. He sort of bailed out of it. The reason I'm not showing you one is we don't have one. We have a replica of it. But he started working on a very similar camera, slightly smaller. Basically, he just called it Eastman's detective camera for a while, and eventually it became called the Kodak. This is a pre-production sample. It's a prototype, serial number 6. In November of 1887, they actually made 6 models to try them out to see if it would work. So this is the oldest known Kodak camera. It used, again, what they called American film. However, this is a smaller version of it. This is a package for the film for the Kodak. Very rare. We believe this is the only one of these that there is known. If anybody has one, let me know. We recently acquired this, by the way, with funds provided by Bob Shambrook, who actually has done several books on making film for Kodak. So with this film, and this is the instructions for the camera is right here. With the Kodak itself, it was a very simple to use box camera. The instructions really consisted of hold the camera, point it, trip the shutter, advance, turn the key to advance the film. Pretty simple. They made about 5,000 of these. This is an image of the workers actually making the cameras. I guess if we started counting them, we might be able to come up with somewhere around 5,000 there. The production version of it looks like this. This is serial number 81. Slightly different from the one that I showed you, but again, very simple. The little knob on the top of the camera looks like it'd be something that you'd use to turn on a pull chain lamp. That is the string that you use to cock the shutter. So you cock the shutter, put it in the camera, trip the shutter. Very easy to use. In fact, if you get into the whole construction of this, everything about this, relatively speaking, is pretty simple. These cards actually show the viewfinder, which, needless to say, that's the angle of view. Anything you point it at, that would be in the picture. And on the right, numbered 1 through 100 is the exposure counter, believe it or not. As you took the pictures, you actually crossed them off. And if you wanted to, you could annotate what those pictures were. And if you like mechanical things, 1 through 100, you can still use this today, as the saying goes. So the camera was sold with the advertising slogan, "You press the button, we do the rest." And it's the "we do the rest" part was what really made this go. Because with the Kodak, was Eastman's solution to what all the photographers, the professionals, complained about. They processed it. You'd actually send the entire camera back to Rochester. They would process the film, return the camera, and eventually return your 100 pictures. And by the way, you did get 100 pictures. If you had 25 that were good and 75 that weren't, they would make 4 copies of each, so you'd get a total of 100. And it was kind of an interesting way to go. It was an expensive camera. It sold for $25. That included the 100 load of film, exposures of film, and processing was an additional $10. He also intended to sell these worldwide. We have a list of vendors worldwide he sold them. This is actually an advertisement that gives you an idea that he sold things in multiple languages. Sample image from the Kodak. The film was 70 millimeters in width. The image would be slightly smaller, maybe 65 millimeters, and they were all circular. This was a way to make it much easier for the user to produce images. If they were slightly askew, the printer could correct them. Also, within a year or so, Eastman comes out actually with a new film. And this is actually a big deal. This is Eastman's, what they call transparent film. This is the nitrate-based film. I said just a second ago that the film was 70 millimeters in width. When Thomas Edison was doing experiments for motion pictures, they actually took the film from the Kodak, split it in half, and perforated, and that's where 35 millimeter motion picture films comes from, is from the Kodak nitrate film. Also in 89, 89 was when the nitrate film came out, Eastman introduced the #2 Kodak. Basically, it's the same camera, except it's slightly larger. The first version, which people now, oddly enough, call the #1 Kodak, produced an image that was 2.5 inches in diameter. The #2 was 3.5 inches in diameter. And Eastman very shortly decided he wanted to take this to Europe to try to sell it. And here's a picture of Eastman on board the USS Gallia using a #2 Kodak. So it's actually an image of Eastman taken with a #2 Kodak of him using a #2 Kodak. Obviously, $25 for a camera is a lot of money in the late 1880s. So the goal was to reduce the cost of the camera. So within a few years, Eastman comes up with what's called the Pocket Kodak, 1895. This produced an image that was 1.5 by 1 by 1.5 inches, sold for $5. That's still quite a bit of money. However, it was a pretty decent camera. Now, when you start looking at these pictures, you have to realize that these cameras were used to be used outdoors on sunny days. The sensitivity of the film was about, if we're going to be kind, somewhere in the 2 to 5 range. The shutter speeds were about a 20th of a second. The lenses were around speed of about f9. So not something that you're going to use on low light, but they work pretty good for the afternoon, mid-afternoon on a sunny day, which obviously in Rochester today would not be a good day for this camera. To make things a little bit larger image-wise, because you also got to realize that the size of the camera really determined the size of the picture. They're largely contact prints. So they started making slightly bigger cameras, and one way to do that was to make ones that would fold. So this is the first model of the folding pocket Kodak, 1897. So this is going to give you a 2.5 by 4 inch size image, and it folds down to something, well, we'd call it probably a coat pocket size. Folding cameras like this became quite popular. They would actually be produced by Eastman Kodak companies and others really for about the next 50 years or so. This camera is called the Brownie, comes out in 1900. It basically is pretty much what Eastman was after. This was a camera they sold for $1. It was originally intended for children, but adults used it. Pretty much it made the same quality picture that the $25 Kodak did, but sold for $1. So in just a 12-year period, you've gone from a sales price from $25 to $1. Now it used paper-backed roll film, which was basically is still sold today as 120 roll film. It's actually the same size, believe it or not. This camera, particular version, used 6 exposures of film. They called it number 117 when they started numbering films. Somewhere around 1912 or so. Originally, when it was sold, it would have been just film for the Brownie. So 6 pictures. The film cost 15 cents. Processing was 45 cents out of a camera that cost $1. Now, this is from probably the first month's production. It's in pretty much mint condition. They slightly changed the design of the camera shortly after. If you look towards the back of the camera, you'll notice it has a couple little wrinkled spots around where the back comes off. Those would tear, so they actually changed to a hinge with a metal clip to hold it in place. Still sold it for $1. They were advertised worldwide. Again, this happens to be a ad for children using the camera, photographing a Brownie character. The next thing, that real big milestone in Eastman Kodak Company lore, is the hiring and the establishment of the research labs at Eastman Kodak Company. With all of Eastman's trials and tribulations relative to sensitized materials film, he realized that this was something that was much more complicated, something you really couldn't do in your own kitchen, if you would. So they set up a corporate lab, and they hired Dr. Mies to head the lab. Mies had been working for a company called Ratton and Wainwright in England. They were the first company that successfully manufactured panchromatic plates. This means black and white film or plates that were sensitive to all of the colors. The original film was really sensitive to blue and green for the most part. So this was established really with the idea of doing thorough investigations as to what was going on with film, and also with the possibility of getting into color film. 1912 also was when the vest pocket Kodak was first introduced. This particular version is the more expensive autographic version with leather covering. This is a very small camera that really just about will fold into modern day shirt pockets, if you would. Fold it up, it's really somewhat in the size of a smartphone, if you would. This particular camera belonged to Ansel Adams. He donated it to the museum in the 1950s when we first opened up. In the folding camera range, probably one of the most popular of all was the 3A size. That's postcard size images. Use number 122 film. Postcard size is 3¼ by 5½ inches, roughly, again, the size of a postcard. This was the deluxe version that was fitted with a rangefinder. And this was the first camera. You can see a detail of the rangefinder on the bottom of this. This was the first camera in the world that had a coupled rangefinder. And when we start thinking about this, focusing on cameras, especially at this time period, has to be precise. Originally, they just would have had a distance scale measured onto it. You'd either have to guess the distance. With this case, you could actually use a rangefinder. It's an optical device that very accurately, using 2 windows and some triangulation, determines the distance. More expensive cameras that would come out a few years from this particular point in the mid to late 1930s or early 30s, such as the Leica, would have built-in coupled rangefinders. But Kodak was the first to do this. They also had this autographic feature. There was a little door on the back that you could write whatever you wanted on the picture. If you exposed it to the sun, it would show up. So this is an example of a 3A image that actually used the autographic feature. Eastman decided that cameras really needed to start looking a little bit different than just black boxes. So he went to New York and actually hired a designer, Walter Darwin Teague, and they started creating all sorts of interesting looking cameras made out of different colors, specialized products. This particular one is called the Coquette. It was designed for women. It was with cosmetics by Coty. It had a matching kind of nice Art Deco box in front of the camera. These are pretty rare. We have two in the collection at the Eastman Museum. I'm aware of just a couple others. Now, they did sell the cameras separately, but as far as the matching cosmetics, the lipstick and the powder, those were just with this kit, and they're really, really quite rare. Eastman and the company started to get into again, making inexpensive cameras. Now, Mr. Eastman passed away in 1932, so a lot of this stuff that you're going to look at now is past his time. In 1934, they introduced the Baby Brownie. This is a Bakelite camera. It was the first of the plastic cameras that were manufactured in the United States. And again, it was intended to be an entry-level children's camera. One of the more interesting cameras that we get into is the Retina number 117. For those Retina aficionados out there, you'll notice that we're calling it number 117, not type. Due to research that's come to light by Mr. David Jentz, we've since decided, or he concluded, that the original names that they used in the pre-war cameras was number. That's what Dr. Nagel had done. Type actually was a term that they used after the war. So the 117 is the first 35mm camera made by Eastman Kodak Company. It's a folding camera, kind of a high-end thing, was sort of competing with the Leicas and the Contaxes at the time. And even rarer yet is this example of film right here. As far as we know, and again, I'll attribute to David Jentz, the 635 is the first of the German-style Kodak film magazines. This is really unusual. I don't think very few people have seen this. I can probably say about a handful have seen this. We just came across this recently. So this is 35mm film that uses a paper leader and trailer on a core. And this was intended to be used for the Retina, the Leica, and the Contax camera. We actually have two other examples of this in the George Eastman Museum collection. In the United States, this would be the first style of the 35mm film magazine. Easy to identify, not easy to find. Those of you who know what 35 film looks like, there's two unusual little buttons that are attached to the parts that come apart the snap cap magazine. So this is the first style. And around this same time, we get into what we call Kodachrome, color film. This was done originally researched by Manis and Godowski. They were musicians who also were scientists. Eastman company had heard about their research, decided to hire them, fund them, and actually move them to Rochester. And what they were doing is they produced a film that was a multi-layered black and white film that basically had placeholders for where the colors would go, if you would. So it's a multi-layered black and white film for placeholders for where the colors would be. So this is the first packaging for Kodachrome. This is for daylight. They also had it for artificial tungsten light film, 1935. Kodak magazines, by the way, would sort of change styles. If you kind of line them all up, you can see what happens from the left to right, the second version, the third version, and so on. The main difference between the two on the left and the right is the ones on the right are crimped. You actually need to have a special opener or a church key, if you would, to process the film. The previous two could be reloaded, and that was what the concern was. They didn't want to have somebody else putting their film, non-Kodak film, in Kodak film magazines. And these are still used today, by the way, the style on the right. So in high-end Kodak innovation, we have the Super Kodak 620. Comes out in 1938. This is the first camera for automatic exposure. If you look just above the lens, you'll see kind of a funny little checkered glass pattern. That's the light meter itself. And one other feature that most people don't quite realize, if you look at the lens, it has a slight, odd non-clear color to it. This is the beginning of color-coded lenses. The company started doing this. They weren't telling anybody they were doing this, and it had to do with the fact for color film, you really wanted to have coded lenses. So the Super 620 is was made in pretty small numbers. They sold 1938 again. I believe they made about 250 of them, and they listed price-wise for about $225. So that was quite a bit of money in 1938. So we're going to flip around to the other side of the case here, look at the rest of the cameras that we have on display. The first one is the Brownie Flash 20. This is the first Kodak camera that had could use a flash bulb. This was an add-on flash. If you look just above the lens, you'll see what looks like two screws. Those, in fact, are screws. They're attached to some round cylinders. Those each hold AA batteries. Flash bulbs were quite large. This is a press 11 bulb, meaning used by press photographers, puts out quite a bit of light. Inside that bulb is a little bit of aluminum wire. So when the current hits that wire, it actually lights, if you would, catches on fire and burns and creates a pretty bright flash. To synchronize that, the bulb actually is ignited before the shutter goes off. So this is another one of the Teague style cameras, but again, with the added flash. The Kodak Extra was kind of one of the high points of Eastman Kodak Company manufacturing. This was a camera that was designed to compete with the Leica. It's a 35mm camera with interchangeable lenses, and these are coated lenses, the Kodak Ektar lenses. So their highest quality lens at the time. It had interchangeable lenses and interchangeable film magazines and a whole bunch of other accessories. Next to it, you'll see a print of a Kodachrome slide, which they would have called a Kodachrome print at the time. Again, looks slightly different from prints today because of the type of materials that you're putting it on. This is the complete kit of the Extra, showing the camera, film magazines. Actually, this one has a ground glass back in it. You can actually focus right off the film plane with it. Lenses, filters, rangefinders, and viewfinders to match the telephoto and wide-angle lenses. So the lenses for this camera were available, were in 35mm focal length, 50, 90, 135, and 153. The 153 is pretty rare. They also had a number of other prototype lenses, which you also have in the collection. We have a 28, we have a 65 macro lens, and an 85, and a 254mm telephoto. So they really went all out when it came to this particular camera. Onto the more less expensive cameras, we get, again, the Brownie Star Flash, 1957. This is the first Kodak camera with a built-in flash. And to the right of it is a typical image that would have been made with this camera. The Star Flash is interesting, aside from the flash, and the fact that it came in multiple colors. The red, white, and blue ones came as outfits or kits that would have been sold with film, flash bulbs, and batteries. The black one would have been a blister pack camera. And the Coca-Cola was a premium camera, which if you would have sent your sales receipts into Coca-Cola, you would get one of those. The Coca-Cola is the really rare version of this. Next up on the high end of camera design, if you would, is the Instamatic 100, 1963. The company invested quite a bit of money into the Kodak cartridge. They're convinced that people had trouble loading film into cameras, and I can say for sure that was actually happened. I spent a little bit of time working in a camera store, and some of the customers would actually bring their cameras in to have the knowledgeable staff behind the counter load it. It was advertised as a very simple to use camera. You can see this rather attractive young lady loading the camera while wearing gloves. Pretty amazing when you think about that. There's no film to be threaded here. It was also one of their classic "Open Me First" Christmas advertised products. Next up on the chart of innovation is electronic flash. So the Kodak Extralight 10 comes out. It uses the 110 cartridge, which had been introduced in 1972. But by this time in 78, they added the built-in electronic flash to the camera. And this is one of the kits now sold with the color film. The Kodak disc comes out in 1982. This was to be the shirt pocket size camera. I was never really that excited about the disc camera until I learned a little bit more about it when I came to the museum. Dr. Rudolph Kingslake, who'd been the hired by George Eastman as the company's lens designer back in the 1920s. He was a volunteer at the museum. He would come in every day. He was in his late 80s, early 90s when I came to the museum. He's told me that this was the best camera they ever made, and it had to do with the design of lens. This was the Kodak's first glass A-sphere lens. But the interesting thing about it was the film itself. It came on a disc. The biggest problem with this film is it was pretty small and it didn't quite have the resolution that they're hoping to. Some people consider this camera to not be very successful, but you want to realize that they sold over 25 million of them. So success is always in the eye of the beholder, I guess, as the saying goes. Now we'll sort of jump into a little bit of digital photography. This is Steve Sasson holding his 1975 digital camera that he designed when he first came to the company. This used the charge coupled device. This camera is actually on display at the Kodak Center up on State Street. But it sort of led to a real revolution of it. Another camera that's has been kind of really overlooked over the years is this guy right here. This is designed by Peter Dillon and Al Bro, and this is the first color CCD camera. So basically it used the same chip that Mr. Sasson's camera was using, but they put a color filter over it to produce, in this case, color video, but it's really the beginning of color. And along that same lines, it uses, instead of this is the Bayer array, which is an arrangement of, as you can see, more greens relative to red and blues. The previous camera actually used a line pattern. The Bayer array was patented in 1976. It should eventually lead to this guy right here. This is the Kodak DCS 200, the company's first color DSLR, 1992. These were pretty expensive cameras. They sold for about $28,000 as a kit. I think they made about 3,000 of them. Recently, I was able to get one working again by connecting it to a Mac PowerBook G3 running OS 9 from about 2003. I installed Photoshop CS2, and with a little bit of help of Jim McGarvey, the gentleman who designed this, I was able to get the Kodak Acquire plugin to work with it. So this gives you an idea of what the images would have looked from a Kodak DCS 200 from 1992 that I made last December. The first color inexpensive camera, if you would have been the Apple QuickTake 100. That was a Apple branded Kodak camera, very similar to the DC-40. The DC-40 comes out in 95. The Apple QuickTake was 94. Two differences. The Apple QuickTake uses 3 AA batteries. The Kodak version uses 4. The Kodak version makes a slightly larger picture and will actually store, I think, up to 8 of them. I think that the Apple is slightly fewer than that. The other main difference from using the 2 of them, I can tell you, is the batteries in the QuickTake will let you make about 6 pictures, and I think the Kodak will, you can maybe do 8 or 9. So 1994, these sold for about $700, and this again is a very similar sample image from the DC-40. So 1995, this is what you would have got. At the time, we all considered it an expensive way to make a bad picture, but things would improve over the years. Real milestone is the Kodak DC 210. This comes out in 1997. It was the best-selling digital camera from 1997 through 1999. This is the world's first megapixel camera that sold for under $1,000. It had a review panel on the back. Basically was pretty decent if you get into, I mean, if to kind of put it into some sort of comparison, this is the kind of quality image you'd get out of a one-time use camera from the time, which would have cost around $10 versus the digital, which sold for about $7.95, I believe is what these went for. But it, being digital, there are other things you could do with it. You could share images with your friends much easier. Rather than handing them to them, you could actually click a mouse and send it to them. And the last one in that case is the Kodak Pro 14N. This particular example is not the one that's in the case. This was the last Pro camera made by Eastman Kodak Company. It had a full-size 24 by 36 millimeter sensor that was used CMOS technology. So it's the first of the CMOS cameras. What's unique about the one that we're showing you is this particular camera is the last camera that was made in Rochester, New York. And I know that because this one was basically built specifically for the George Eastman Museum after the program had been shut down. So the camera was made in 2006, even though the program ended in 2004. So that kind of brings us to the end of my talk. And I guess I'll hand it back over to Nick for any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Todd. Todd, if you want to leave your presentation up and keep that up in case you want to, in case you need to refer back to any images, feel free to bring it back up if you'd like.
Okay.
So yeah, we have a lot of really great questions that have come in and some more coming in, and wow, they're pouring in now. So all right, I'm gonna start near the top here. So Rob Camo is asking if you needed to send the camera back to Kodak, what was the box roll film for?
Okay, so the box of roll film, first of all, that's extremely rare. It sold for around $2.50. That was 10%. So the camera came loaded with film. However, and again, you had the option of sending it back. The camera came with instructions for processing. And in the catalog, it actually listed that you could buy film and load it yourself if you chose to. I suspect most people did not choose to do this. I mean, I tout that because it's basically an incredibly rare thing. I've seen that in the film in the catalogs for years. I was never convinced that it actually existed until basically we came across that one a few years ago. My reasoning behind this has to do with, again, the company set aside things. My thinking had been, well, if it was that important, they would have saved one probably. They saved lots of other things that I thought was unlikely. But no, there was not. So we actually acquired this off an eBay auction a few years ago, and then the nitrate film was like a week later from the same dealer. So you had your choice to answer the question. You could either have the company do it, or you could do it yourself. It was your choice.
All right. So our next question is going to be from Kevin Wynn. And Kevin asked, why did Edison slit the 70mm film? Expense?
Yeah, that would be my guess. The gist of it is the film was expensive to make. They were looking at making an image size that was basically 1 by 1.5. So if you get into the size of 35mm motion picture film, it's actually 18 by 24 is what they established. I'm assuming that at the time, again, you got to look at the Edison machine which we also have, but not part of this exhibit. They were viewing the film in a very small viewer. They decided that was as big as they needed at the time. So resolution is always has a little asterisk with it, I guess. It's what you consider to be high at that time. So I would say expense would be my answer to that.
Okay. The next question is coming from Jerry Zemansky. Jerry says, Todd, was the autographic camera used to take real photo postcards?
Yes, they actually sold paper that was marked postcard on the back. So if you bought Kodak and or various other companies that sold it, their postcard paper, so you could take a picture with your camera, print it on the postcard papers, put a stamp on it, and mail it as a postcard. So that is correct.
All right. The next question is from Paula Jeanette. Were the 1930s Panatomic and Kodachrome films still nitrate-based?
Okay, nitrate-based films gets to be kind of complicated. There was not one given date per se when everything migrated from one to another. So in the case of those particular ones that we would have had up, those would have been safety films. However, some of the other film bases stayed on nitrate well into the 1950s. So some of the unusual sizes, panoramic film, for instance, stayed nitrate for quite a while. So again, to repeat, there was not really a specific date when they shifted. The safety film base actually started in in the teens, 16 millimeter Kodak motion film was always on safety film. So it just really, over a period of time, the emulsions changed.
Okay, so I'm actually going to combine two questions together here for you. So if you can remember this. So the first part of the question is from Dwight Foltz, and Dwight asks, what is a barrel shutter and how does it work? And then I'm going to pair that with another lens question from Grace Sieberling, who asked, how did they think about could you talk about lenses? How did they talk about quality with the early cameras? And where did they get 5,000 lenses for the earliest cameras?
Okay, so the barrel shutter was what was used in the original Kodak. And what that is if you take a piece of tubing or pipe and you drill a hole through it, put the lens in the middle of the pipe and rotate it around, that's the barrel shutter. Okay, so it's basically opening and closing. And that, by the way, was a patent that Mr. Eastman was given for the shutter in the lens for the Kodak. Okay, as far as where did the lenses for the Kodak come, that's for the 5,000 lenses. The original Kodak camera used lenses that were made by Bausch and Lomb in town here. Bausch and Lomb had made their first photographic lens in 1887. They were the supplier for all of the Kodak lenses for the Kodak cameras, and actually for most of them for the next few years. Now, lens manufacturing at Eastman Kodak Company is kind of interesting. They started making their own lenses about 1915. They realized that they were going to run into problems due to the war in Europe at the time. So that's really when Kodak established their own lens manufacturing. The earlier cameras like the Brownies, those are pretty simple lenses. Just about anybody who made glass could have made those lenses. It's the compound lenses that get to be complicated. Originally, if you look at the folding Kodaks, you'll see that they have all sorts of different lenses on them. It would depend on, first of all, where they were sold. Sometimes it was a value added as an export thing, whether it was sold in England, they'd export the bodies that were made in Rochester, and then they would apply British lenses such as Cook to it. And also in the US, the more expensive folding Kodaks could have had Zeiss lenses on it. So it's a pretty complicated topic, but once you get into the 1915 and on, all of the lenses would have been made by Eastman Kodak Company.
And about the 5,000.
I think she's asking where 5,000, I was assuming that she's talking about the number of Kodak cameras that were made. They made 5,000 cameras, so I'm thinking 5,000 lenses.
Got it. Okay, cool. All right, so the next question is from Elisa Barbash. And Elisa asked, was the first flash one-time use or multiple?
Flash bulbs are one use. It's basically the aluminum wire that's inside the bulb burns up and then it's done. One and done.
All right. Stuart Glickman asked, I'm holding an unopened roll of Kodak film 116 1940. Common?
Yeah, that's kind of a tough question to answer. They sold more film than people used, so possibly it could be unused. I don't, you could probably try it. Usually what happens with older films, depending on how they were stored, there'll be an expiration date on the box. If it gets too hot, it doesn't do well. You'll have quite a bit of base fog on it. So common, I would say not common, but not extremely rare either, because they made large quantities of roll film.
Okay. So I do want to let everybody know there's 44 questions out there. I'm not sure that we're going to have time for Todd to get to all of those, but I am going to keep plugging through these and try to get to as many as we can. Let's see here. Lucia Martino writes, hi, Todd. Thanks for this webinar. It's great to see all these cameras and hear their history. Are most or all of these cameras and info in your Camera, A History of Photography from Daguerreotype to Digital book? Cheers.
Yes, I believe just about everything that we covered will be in the book. There are a couple of things, however, that's not. We did not have the samples of the original Kodak film when the last book came out. Those are fairly recent acquisitions within the last couple of years. The digital cameras are in there. I did not have the DCS 200 working at the time, so I don't believe I had a sample image from the DCS 200. Other than that, and well, also the Genesee view would not be in there because that's something that we just purchased maybe 6 weeks or so ago. So, but other than those 3 or 4 things, everything else would be in the book.
Okay. So Thomas Myers asked, wasn't the DCS 100 the first color DSLR professional camera?
The DCS 100 was a monochrome camera, did not do color.
Okay.
The 200 is the first color camera.
All right.
Well, there's an asterisk. You could make color separation images with the 100. They actually had a motorized filter for red, green, and blue that would run in front of it. So you could, if you had the color wheel accessory, shoot a color still life with a DCS 200, or as they called it, the DCS. So yes, sort of.
Okay. So to follow up to Thomas, Thomas did say if we have any questions, he wrote the Macintosh software that shipped with the Kodak DCS 100. So maybe we can connect with him at some point.
Right.
Lucia Martino also asked, what is the lens on the Kodak Pro 14N?
That particular lens is I believe it's, no, just a second. I think that one has it's a micro Nikkor. I think it's the 55. Yeah, it's a 55 micro Nikkor.
Okay. Bill Wanderer asked, can you comment on the separate evolution of Kodak view cameras? Where did Kodak exit the view camera market?
Okay, so the view cameras have kind of an interesting story. They're actually made originally by the Fulmer Graflex, or what pardon me, the Fulmer Schwing and or Century divisions of Eastman Kodak Company. That was the professional division. They made the studio stand cameras and the Eastman view cameras. So those would have been made through the beginning of the companies, really. From the 1890s through about 1950, the name changed slightly. In the 1950s, they started making the Kodak Master View, which was a 4x5, and they also made a completely different camera, also with the name Master View on it, that was an 8x10, kind of a Deardorff style camera, but made out of metal. So those are the Kodak Master View. The monorail version was actually picked up and sold by Calumet as the Calumet 4x5, and those I believe were on the market through the middle 1960s.
Great. Kevin Morrissey writes, what is the best process to preserve bellows?
Oh, bellows are kind of a complicated thing. It's really going to depend on which type of bellows you have. The earliest are leather outside. There's kind of a cardboard support and a fabric on the inside, and so taking care of leather is a fairly complicated task. What happens is they develop pinholes in the corners. The later cameras have nylon bellows, and those actually seem to hold together pretty well. These days, I'm not a leather conservator. Usually when I ask leather conservators about bellows, they give me a rather unhappy look, because they basically are doing something that is bad for the material. They just basically tear in the corners, and unfortunately there's not a whole lot you can do about it. As far as storing them goes, I usually recommend to leave them about 1/3 open. That puts the least amount of stress on them. But I would say, if you really want a better answer to that, if you send me an email, just todd@eastman.org, I can forward it off to our conservation department, and they can answer the question for you.
Great. Elisa Barbash asks, can you speak about the role of women in camera technology development and construction?
That's really more of an Eastman Kodak company history question. I don't have access to their employee records. Certainly, if you look at the early images, you can see that the cameras were made by women. They had women working for the factory over the years. I would, again, probably refer that question over to probably the University of Rochester, that should have information on how many women worked for the company.
I accidentally just deleted someone's question, so I apologize about that. Let's see here. Enrique Soto asks, is it possible to access the whole catalog of the museum?
We do have most of the cameras online on the museum's website. If you click the eMuseum link at, Nick, do you know the web address off the top of your head?
Well, Eastman.org
Eastman.org
would take you to the main website, and you can access the collections from the main website.
Yeah, so eMuseum will have basically, we have the cameras up from the technology department. We don't have the lenses and shutters and the rest of that stuff up yet. We're working on it. It's a big collection, and unfortunately, we're a two-person department.
Okay, so I think I remember the question that I accidentally deleted. It was, do you have a favorite period of photography or technology?
Well, I actually probably have two areas that I am most interested in. Although it's, you know, in some ways this is sort of like asking a parent, name your favorite child. I'll say I have three areas. I find anything daguerreotype just to be fascinating, just because it's so, I don't know, simple, boxy, with fairly complicated chemistry that goes with it. You know, I'm a product of the late '60s, early '70s, so that era has kind of a sweet spot for me. I'm kind of a big Nikon F fan, and then just you know, I went from being a digital denier to just fascinated with anything digital the last, I don't know, 10 years or so. You know, we were early users of digital photography, but I would say I was a user. I was not an adopter, but I sort of remember the day of, I was going to go on vacation. I went over to a local camera store and I was going to buy some Kodachrome, and they only had Kodachrome 200. And I was kind of not happy, so I suddenly went from shooting Kodachrome in my Leica M3 to jumping into digital cameras within a matter of minutes. And I don't know, I kind of haven't turned back. I still shoot film a couple rolls every year or so.
Cool. So along those lines, Penny Emery asked, what is your favorite camera in the collection, Kodak and non-Kodak manufacturer?
Well, you know, it's like sort of asking me what's my favorite shiny new object. So my favorite camera of the day is the Genesee View, only because I was never convinced they made them. The order book says they made 100 of them. At this point, I know of maybe a half a dozen, thanks to a couple of collectors around the country. We acquired one at an auction maybe 6 weeks or so ago. So that certainly is one of them. The color camera designed by Peter Dillon is something that I just find amazing. It's kind of way over the top, trying to figure out how they would ever come up with a way to do that. So those are probably two at the moment. Steve Sassen's camera certainly would be my third one on the list. I want to leave Steve out.
And I think that might answer the next question. Laura Zagarowicz asked, do you know which Kodak camera is most rare that collectors are seeking out today? I'd have to imagine that Sassen's camera is the most rare, but
well, that's not a production camera. That's a prototype.
Yeah.
The Genesee View is as far as production goes. We saw just the back side of it. that's a camera that was in production at the same time as the original Kodak, which is the other reason I find it really interesting. It sort of shows that Mr. Eastman still had his hands in many pots, so to speak. He was interested in producing a consumer inexpensive camera and also the Kodak at the same time. So I find it really fascinating that he was really trying to do this. So the Genesee View would be the one I'd say is the rarest right now.
Great. Amber Kehoe asked, like musical instrument preservation, are there efforts to keep the cameras kept in working order?
We store the cameras in a very stable environment. The technology vault that I showed you the image of, it has temperature settings now very stable at 68 degrees, 45% humidity. Camera working is kind of an interesting concept. So there's depending on what camera it was, some of them may have never worked when they were new. I mean, so we have things that are fairly inexpensive. Newer products are actually more complicated than the old products because they've got more parts that fail, if you would. I would like them to work. We don't, but that's not a requirement for us to have them in the collection. And unfortunately, we just don't have anybody to repair them. So,
Victoria Paranyuk asks, did Eastman ever venture into motion picture cameras?
Eastman basically ventured into motion picture cameras with the Cine Kodak. It was the first 16 millimeter camera. Commercial product is 1923. He started evolving into it in really starting around 1920. So we have a number of the prototypes for that process. So yes, he did get into amateur motion pictures. He didn't get into professional equipment because he didn't want to compete with his buddy Thomas Edison.
All right.
16 millimeter and smaller, nothing bigger than 16.
All right, next question is from Bruno Halafor. Bruno asks, why did Kodak have cameras made in Germany? Retina collaboration with Schneider, question? European market?
Eastman purchased the August Nagel Camera Works in the mid-1920s. He also purchased camera works around the world and the US. So basically, he decided, or they must have seen something there that they wanted. So as far as collaborations, the Retina cameras have all kinds of different lenses on them. We recently have acquired a collection of Retinas from England, some of which have Zeiss lenses on them. So it depends on where they were sold and who they got lenses from at the time. So the first Retinas, depending on where they were sold, would determine which lens they would have on them.
Thomas Hone asks, enjoying this, Todd. Tom Hone here, watching from Dallas. You shared some recent film format acquisitions. Is there a Kodak camera that you wish GEM had in their collection that they currently don't?
Thomas, throwing the bait out. I'll just say yes.
I think I know what.
If there are Kodak cameras that we don't have, I would like to have it. We don't have we have a #2 cone Kodak. I don't have a #1 cone Kodak. That's from roughly 1900. There's a few odds and ends, pretty rare things that we don't have. And again, it goes back to the company set aside things as they were produced. There are some things that were sold by Kodak divisions around the world that we don't have, so we don't have a complete run of the Kodaks that are sold and produced in England. We have a few of them, and we also don't have things that were done in France and whatever. But so those sorts of things I would like to have. Unfortunately, if you get into the amount of space that we have to store it, I'm basically trying to store an infinite collection in a finite space. So there's only so much we can really put in there. There are a few things that I'd like to have. I'll just leave it at that.
Here's a good question that I think you may have some fun with. Jihei Kim asks, did Kodak also make Polaroid camera? If not, how did the company respond to it?
Well, okay, to kind of track the Polaroid story down, Eastman originally made Polaroid sensitized materials. So for the instant cameras that were made in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, that was all produced by Eastman Kodak Company. Eastman Kodak Company kind of concurrently with the SX70 produced their own version, the Kodak instant camera. That's the lawsuit camera. So yes, they did produce them. It's a rather complicated lawsuit that I'm still not quite sure that I understand the result of. I know the financial result of it, but it's a kind of a confusing topic, to be honest with you. I'm not a patent attorney, so I'll just say they made them and they were told to stop making them.
Okay, so we've got time for just a couple more questions. Rosemary DeRitter asks, can you please say the name of the model of the camera that allowed you to write on the negative? I'm interested in learning more about how that was done.
Okay, that's the autographic process that was a patent that Eastman actually acquired, and it was a roll of film that also had a roll of carbon, if you would, on the back of it, sort of all in between the paperback roll film and the film itself was a carbon layer. The camera had a little back door that you would open. It came with a little scribe or pencil, if you would. You would be able to write on that, open the door, expose it to the light, and then close the door. And when you got your print back, what you wrote would actually show up in white on the bottom of the picture. So that's the autographic process. And those cameras were sold from roughly 1915 until about 1940.
Okay, so this is a lengthy question, but I'll read it as quickly as I can. So Bill Browninger writes, I have a box of Eastman Kodak dry plates that belonged to my great-grandfather, one of American Vitagraph's founders. I am trying to identify the subjects of the negatives, and being able to date the plates would be helpful. The box has a very simple label, but kit does include an emulsion number. I also have a few of my great-grandfather's cameras, including a Curtin Aperture Auto Graflex Jr. The camera is in fair shape, and besides needing a couple of rivets missing on the carrying strap, might profit from a bit of cleaning and other services. Should I even consider restoration repair of either?
Okay, probably the best way to answer that would be if you just send me pictures of that. I can answer it offline. Again, my email is todd@eastman.org. It's really hard to answer that sort of question without being able to see the objects.
Okay. And I have a question that I know that we are not going to have time to answer today, but I think it's a good prompt for maybe another one of these webinars in the near future. What is the extensive history of photo products that Kodak made for the US military and later space programs? So that is a kind of a talk in itself to answer that question, I think. But if people are interested in that, I think that maybe we could think about putting something together.
Yeah, that's kind of a complicated topic because actually some of the films may still be classified. Every time I get kind of jump down this rabbit hole, we don't always get a great answer. We do know they made things for various departments. It would depend on the time period and the purpose. Obviously, they made stuff for the various satellites. They made film for Lunar Orbiter and so on. So so the answer is yes, they did make the stuff. I don't have a lot of information on that available. I usually have to go to other sources, and sometimes the sources can answer the question and sometimes they can't. Again, I think this is another one of those questions. If you wanted to toss it to me via email, I'd be happy to look at it.
Okay. Nasir Hamid wrote, is this webinar being recorded for later viewing? I just joined and didn't realize the time difference, but from the UK, wasn't 5 hours as usual, so he's missed it. So Nasir, Yes, we are recording this, and as soon as we can get a chance to get the video edited and up on, probably it will be on our YouTube page, I imagine. So hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we'll have this online so you can refer back to it. So I'm going to do one more question, and let's see here. With technology changing as quickly as it does, which digital format and platform do you believe is best to convert photographs? In essence, is it a guessing game as to what technology will last long enough for a future archivist to convert onto another platform?
The 29-cent question. Yeah, it's always hard to shoot a moving target, as the saying goes. Not that I'm encouraging anybody to shoot moving targets, or photograph moving targets. But yeah, I mean, I think once we get into the digital age, it's more a matter of being flexible. I think trying to pick who's going to be the winner in this case is really I don't think that's really the question. I think the question, or the better answer, is to say that you're going to have to be willing to migrate. In the museum world, we've all been trained to deal with a physical object that you can put your hands around. In the case of digital, that isn't necessarily the case. It's more a matter of being able to be flexible, realizing that you've got to work with what you're going to have, and you're going to have to continue to migrate. So in some ways, and I don't know if this is a cop-out answer or not, but it's the fact that ones and zeros can be made to last forever as long as you're willing to be an active participant. We're used to, basically, in the case of photographs, is you can put them in an archival box and stick them in a drawer, and they pretty much take care of themselves with more or less for quite a while. In the case of digital, you have to be an active participant. So you have to migrate from media to media, and quite likely format to format as things change. So again, probably not necessarily a great answer, but I think that's sort of where we are right now.
Okay, we're going to wrap things up here. Thank you all for watching. We appreciate everyone tuning in. And like I said, hopefully we will be rolling out a few more of these webinars, whether they're related to technology objects or photography collection or our George Eastman legacy collection or our moving image collection. Well, that's to be determined, but we're working on some new content for everybody. Todd, if you could please just say the email address one more. Is it Todd at Eastman?
Yeah, Todd at Eastman.org. TODD at Eastman.org.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you all for coming. For those of you that we didn't get a chance to get to your questions, do apologize. We've got like another hour's worth of questions, so we're going to give Todd a little break here, but we're going to try and type answers to those of you who have questions that we haven't gotten to yet. So thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you all soon, virtually probably. Thank you.